Welcome, today's story is full of drama. Like and subscribe to stay updated. Let's get started.
I've always been a man who knew what I wanted, whether it was in business or in life. Running a leather tanning business in Ashford, Tennessee, keeps me on my toes, but it's also given me the kind of stability I never imagined I'd have. When Melissa passed away, I didn't know how I'd keep going. Naomi was only 8 at the time and I was overwhelmed. But then Margaret, my mother, stepped in and raised her. I can never thank her enough for that. Naomi's 18 now, starting college. Time flies. I see her grow more every day into the young woman she's meant to be, and I couldn't be prouder. But there's always this part of me, this hole left by Melissa. I guess I never fully healed from losing her. Sometimes, I catch myself thinking about her and imagining what life would have been like if she were still here. Sophia came into my life when I wasn't looking. We met at a local fashion show. She was the kind of woman you couldn't miss, tall, confident, with that quiet intensity that made her stand out even in a room full of models. I was instantly drawn to her, though I didn't admit it to myself at first. When we started dating, it was like something clicked. I knew we were both a bit older with a lot of baggage, but I didn't care. She was unlike anyone I'd ever met. After a year, we got married. Naomi wasn't thrilled at first, but she came around. We built a life together, and for a time it was good, at least that's how it seemed on the surface. I've never been one for a quiet life, not until Melissa. Before her, I was a different man. Someone who lived in the shadows, doing what I did best, no questions asked. I was a Mossad agent once, back in Israel, before the politics got too messy and my loyalty was tested. When it all fell apart, I did what I knew best, became a mercenary. It's not a pretty job, but someone has to do it. The money was good, the work even better. I learned how to erase everything in my path. No trace. No trace left behind. No body, no crime. Simple as that. But then Melissa came into my life. I remember the first time I saw her. She was nothing like the women I was used to, quiet, intelligent, grounded. She didn't ask questions, she just accepted me for who I was. And then came Naomi and everything changed. I never thought I'd be a father, never imagined myself in that role. But there I was, holding my daughter, and something inside me shifted. I was still involved with the Colombian cartel at the time. The job was easy, too easy, until one day, everything went to hell. We'd been on a family trip. Naomi was only 8 but already growing so fast. Melissa and I had planned to get away, a rare break from the chaos of my life where we could just be a family. We didn't get many chances like that. I should have seen it for what it was, our last chance. We were in a small town near the border, far enough from everything to feel like we could breathe. The plan was simple: take Naomi to see some of the local sights, let her enjoy a day of fun. But life had other plans. We were walking down a narrow street when it happened. I didn't see them coming at first. The cartel had been laying low, trying to keep things quiet, but a rival faction must have gotten wind of us being there. It wasn't long before everything exploded. The first shot came from behind and Melissa instantly shoved Naomi toward the alley. She was always the protective one, the one who instinctively put Naomi's safety above everything. It wasn't until I heard Naomi scream that I realized what had happened. I spun around, my heart pounding, and saw Melissa on the ground, clutching her side. She wasn't moving. I could see the blood seeping through her fingers, but she didn't cry out. She didn't make a sound. She just looked at me, her eyes wide with fear for Naomi. My instincts kicked in. I ran toward her, but I was too late. One of the gunmen had taken a shot aimed at Naomi, at my daughter, and Melissa threw herself in the way. I reached her in seconds, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Melissa, my voice cracked as I knelt beside her, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was pointless. She was already slipping away. She barely managed to whisper, her voice so faint I could barely hear her. "Take care of her, Daniel. Please. Promise me." Tears stung my eyes, but I couldn't afford to cry. I had to be strong. Strong for Naomi. For Melissa. I promise, I choked out, my hand on hers, trying to hold her steady. But the strength was already leaving her. She took one last breath and then nothing. The world seemed to stop around me, everything fading to a blur. My heart, it broke in that moment. I had always been a man of action, but nothing could prepare me for this. Melissa, my Melissa, was gone. But Naomi. Naomi was everything now. I scooped her into my arms, her little body trembling, and I whispered that everything would be okay. But I knew she could never be the same after this. And neither could I. I had failed her. I had failed both of them. The loss of her shattered me. I thought I could keep going, But that day, I lost a part of myself. And that was when my mother showed up out of nowhere. Margaret. I hadn't seen her in years, and yet, there she was, standing in front of me, her eyes filled with a mixture of disappointment and concern. "Daniel," she said, her voice steady despite the tension hanging in the air. "You need to stop. You've gone too far. This life, it's killing you." I looked at her, feeling the weight of her words more than I wanted to admit. "You don't understand, Ma. I don't know how to stop." She sighed deeply, crossing the room to stand in front of me. "You can. You will. For Naomi. You owe it to her." Her words were a cold slap to my conscience. But deep down, I knew she was right. I'd been living in a nightmare, and it had cost me everything I loved. That day, I promised her I would change. And I did. I walked away from the cartel. I walked away from everything. It wasn't easy, but I had to start fresh. I had money, sure, but that didn't mean anything now. I needed to build something real. Something that could give Naomi a life away from the shadows. And that's when I started the leather tanning business. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And it gave me a purpose I never thought I'd find. I threw myself into the work, rebuilding my life piece by piece. Slowly, the stability I never imagined became my reality. And as time passed, Naomi grew, becoming the young woman I was proud to call my daughter. But every now and then, I couldn't shake the feeling that Melissa's absence was a hole in my chest, a reminder of what could have been. Sophia came in, and for a while it was good. I never expected a call like that. It was around 10:30 p.m., and Sophia and I were just winding down after a night at the fashion show. My mind had been busy, but in the back of my head I knew I was due for some sleep. Then the phone rang. I glanced at the screen. It was a number I didn't recognize. But when I answered, it wasn't a familiar voice. It was a cop. "Mr. Daniel, are you Naomi's father?" "Yes. Yes, I am." "What's going on?" I asked, my voice tight. "We need you to come to Knoxville General Hospital. Your daughter is in serious condition." I could feel the blood drain from my face. "What happened? Is she okay?" "I can't go into details right now, sir. Just get here as fast as you can." My heart was racing. I barely processed what he said as I hung up. Sophia, who had been sitting on the couch, looked up when I set the phone down. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes narrowing in concern. "Naomi's at the hospital." "She's in serious condition," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But the tremble was impossible to ignore. Without thinking, I turned to grab my jacket, my mind already racing. But Sophia's response, it hit me harder than I expected. "Go alone," she said. Her words were so casual, almost dismissive. I stared at her, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. "What do you mean, go alone?" She shrugged, not even looking up from the magazine in her hands. "I don't think I need to be there for this, Daniel. You should go. I'll stay here." I couldn't make sense of it. I wanted to ask why she wasn't coming with me, why she didn't care to support me in the worst moment of my life. But there was no time. Naomi needed me. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my keys, heading out the door. The drive to the hospital felt like it took forever. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, but my mind kept racing. Was she hurt? Was she in some kind of accident? The questions kept coming, but there were no answers. When I finally arrived at the hospital, I barely parked the car before I was sprinting toward the entrance. I didn't even care that I was drawing attention to myself. My only focus was getting to Naomi. As I entered the emergency room, the cop who had called me earlier was standing by the desk. He looked like he'd been waiting for me. "Mr. Daniel?" he asked, his voice steady but not without a hint of urgency. I nodded quickly. "What's going on? Where is she?" He motioned for me to follow him. "Come with me. We'll talk on the way." I walked behind him, trying to keep my breathing steady. My mind was still reeling, my heart racing, but I couldn't get any words out. We walked down the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing above us, and as we neared the treatment area, I could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. He glanced back over his shoulder, catching my eyes. "Your daughter was found at home. There was a confrontation. She's in rough shape." "I'm sorry, but it doesn't look good." I thought I might collapse right there in the hallway. I could barely process what he was saying. "Naomi, what do you mean assaulted?" I managed to choke out, feeling my throat close around the words. He gave me a grim look. Your neighbor called 911 after hearing screams. When the officers arrived, they found your daughter. She'd been beaten up badly and sexually assaulted. We're trying to figure out who did it and why, but as of now, we don't have answers. Initially, we thought it might have been a home invasion, but nothing in the house was ransacked, so the rest of what he said blurred into the background. The words bounced around in my head, but none of it made sense. Naomi, my baby girl, how could someone do that to her? I could feel the rage building up in me, but I couldn't let it out. Not yet. I asked about her condition, my heart in my throat. Is she? She's in a medically induced coma right now, the cop replied quietly, as if even speaking the words made him uncomfortable. They're doing everything they can, but she's critical. My legs felt weak as we reached the room where they were keeping her. I felt like I was walking through a nightmare. The doctor was waiting for me, standing outside her room, his expression somber. Mr. Daniel, I'm Dr. Edwards, he said, shaking my hand. I know this is difficult, but we're doing everything we can. Naomi is stable for now, but we're monitoring her closely. We've sedated her to keep her calm and to give her body the best chance to recover. We'll need to run more tests as soon as she's stable enough, but the injuries are severe. I nodded, my mind trying to process the information. Can I see her? The doctor gave a small nod. Of course. Just be prepared. It's not easy to look at. I didn't care how hard it would be. I needed to be there for her. I needed to see her with my own eyes. I walked into the room, my breath catching as I saw her lying in that bed. Pale and fragile, hooked up to machines. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. My daughter, my little girl, so still. She was so young to be going through something like this. Tears blurred my vision, but I wiped them away quickly. I couldn't break down. Not here. Not now. I pulled up a chair and sat beside her bed, taking her hand gently in mine. Naomi, I whispered, my voice hoarse. I'm here, baby. I'm not going anywhere. I don't know how long I sat there. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, seeing my mother's name on the screen. I couldn't hold it together any longer, but I answered the call. Mom. I quickly explained to her what the cop had told me. Daniel, she said, her voice calm, steady, but I could hear the worry underneath. I'm sorry this happened. I know you're in shock, but I need you to stay at the hospital. Don't go home. I'm coming. I'll be there soon. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, swallowing the lump in my throat. Okay, I'll stay. I won't leave her side. I'm coming, she repeated softly. I stayed at the hospital, unwilling to leave Naomi's side, watching the hours slip by like they didn't even matter. But my mother's tone when she called, that feeling of something being wrong, it never left me. More than 24 hours passed before she finally showed up. When I saw her at the hospital entrance, I could tell something had shifted in her demeanor. She was calm, too calm, like she was carrying something heavy, something she hadn't told me yet. And she wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, tall, serious-looking, with a sharp suit that screamed business. Daniel, she said, her eyes meeting mine with that unreadable look. This is Jordan Novak, a friend of mine. Come with me. We need to talk. I was already on edge, but I didn't argue. I followed them, the questions swirling in my head faster than I could keep up. We drove in silence. The air in the car was thick with unspoken words. When we finally arrived at a small, quiet coffee shop in the outskirts of town, I had no idea what was coming. My mother handed me a coffee and took a seat across from me, her eyes not meeting mine at first. Jordan, the man beside her, remained silent. She took a slow breath before speaking. Let me get straight to the point, she said, her voice low and deliberate. They were looking for you, Daniel. Naomi, she was just a bystander. She got caught in the middle of something bigger. I froze. The coffee cup in my hand suddenly felt heavy. What the hell are you talking about? I asked, my voice sharp. Naomi isn't just some bystander, she's my daughter. She raised a hand, stopping me before I could say anything else. I know, Daniel. I know, she said, her voice steady. But let me explain. I opened my mouth to argue, but she continued before I could get a word out. We intercepted a video, she said, her voice eerily calm. A video on the dark web. My stomach dropped. A video? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her gaze dark. It shows the two men assaulting Naomi, she said. But that wasn't the point. The point was, they were asking about you. They were looking for you. I leaned back in my chair, my pulse hammering. The world around me seemed to shrink. The sound of my heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. What do you mean they were looking for me? Why? I demanded. What the hell is going on? She didn't flinch. She just took a breath and let the words come out like they were nothing more than a simple fact. Naomi wasn't their target, Daniel, she said. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. You're the one they were after. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. The world was spinning and all I could focus on was the terrifying thought that they had been looking for me. Why? Why now? My eyes drifted to the man beside her, Jordan Novak. I wanted to ask him, but my mother cut in again. Her tone shifted slightly, more matter-of-fact now. I had the house covered by cameras, she said, her gaze never leaving mine. Both you and Sophia's phones were tapped by my people. They were tracking you. And it's not just the men who attacked Naomi that are after you. I stiffened. She leaned forward slightly. The Mossad and the cartel, she said quietly. They're both after you, Daniel. My breath hitched. I could barely process what she was saying. The Mossad. The cartel. The very organizations I had tried to escape. Tried to leave behind. When I promised Melissa I would change. And now they were both after me again. And you're just telling me this now? I asked, my voice shaking. You knew all this and you're just telling me now? She shrugged, her expression hardening just a little. I have to protect my family, Daniel, she said. That means you, Naomi, and myself. And sometimes that means doing things you don't understand. You've been on their radar for a long time. But this is bigger than you think. Then she took a deep breath. And this time her voice dropped even lower. But this time she said it wasn't the cartel. I narrowed my eyes. What do you mean? She exhaled slowly. It wasn't the cartel, she said. Not the Mossad either. She met my gaze, her expression unreadable. There is a third enemy. I frowned. A third enemy? I repeated. What the hell are you talking about? She nodded, her face set in stone. It's not the cartel. Not the Mossad, she said. Her voice dropped to a whisper. It's your wife, Daniel. My blood ran cold. I stared at her. What? My mother didn't blink. She didn't hesitate. She was stone cold serious. Sophia planned the whole thing, she said. She hired those men to kill you. I placed the coffee cup back down on the table, my hands suddenly shaking. My voice was barely a whisper. The prenup. If she divorces me, she gets nothing. But if I die? My mother nodded, her gaze sharp. She gets everything. My stomach twisted. My hands curled into fists. That's right, my mother said. It's all in the prenup. She knows that. That's why she hired those two amateurs to do the job. But they screwed up. They got the time and date wrong. We've intercepted all their communications. Everything. Sophia. The woman I married. The woman I trusted. She tried to have me killed. And Naomi had suffered for it. I clenched my jaw, my breath coming in slow, measured inhales. I had to stay calm. I had to think. I just sat there in silence, trying to process it all. My mother leaned forward. What do you want to do, Daniel? She asked. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes narrowing. There was no denying it now. She had been deep in the game all along. And I had been too blind to see it. You cut a deal with the Mossad, didn't you? I asked, my voice steady. She smiled, a slight curve of her lips. Yes, she admitted. 10 years ago, they let go of you. I let out a bitter laugh. And the cartel? She nodded. The cartel will not come after you, she said. The men you trained now run the underworld in Colombia. I stayed silent for a few moments. Then I pulled out my phone. My fingers tapped the screen. A number I hadn't called in years. It only rang once before a familiar voice answered. Long time, the man on the line said. His voice was gruff, but welcoming. I smiled, even in the midst of all this chaos. Yes, I said. It's time for the cleaner to clean some stuff. I sent him an image. 2 men and 1 woman. I need their location by nightfall, I said. There was no hesitation. Consider it done, he replied. I ended the call. Then I looked up at my mother. She was watching me closely, waiting for my next move. I took a deep breath, and I spoke the only words that mattered. I'm going to finish this. By nightfall, I had everything I needed. The cleaner had delivered. The 2 men, Gabe and Butch, were at a rundown bar just outside Knoxville. Sophia was still at home, completely unaware of what was coming for her. I drove in silence. The weight of what I was about to do settled deep in my chest, but there was no hesitation. This wasn't about revenge. This was about balance. Justice. I pulled into the gravel parking lot outside the bar and killed the engine. The cold night air bit at my skin as I stepped out. I took a deep breath, adjusting my jacket. Inside, I could hear laughter. Drunken voices. Oblivious. I pushed the door open. The moment I stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. The two men sat at the counter, laughing, unaware. But the rest of the room? The regulars? They knew something was off. Men in the corner who had been chatting casually suddenly stood up, looking around, feeling the shift. Then the doors locked. The last few patrons were ushered out. Within 5 minutes, there were only 2 men at the counter, and 20 men spread across the tables. All eyes on me. I didn't break my stride. I walked straight to the counter and slid into a seat beside them. Their conversation died instantly. Gabe, the larger one, looked up at me, frowning. I could see the nervousness flicker across his face before he forced a grin. Well, he said, his voice laced with mock bravado. What do we have here? You're a little far from home, aren't you? I didn't respond right away. I leaned in, locking eyes with him. You know why I'm here? Butch, the smaller man, swallowed hard. Gabe chuckled, shaking his head. I don't think we do, he said. Maybe you should enlighten us. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out something small. A lipstick tube. I placed it on the counter between us. Silence. They stared at it, confused. Then realization dawned on their faces. Butch's face turned pale. Gabe forced a grin. You think you're some kind of badass, huh? He sneered. His fingers twitched toward his belt. A knife. I was faster. I grabbed his wrist, twisting it sharply. There was a sickening crack. Gabe howled in pain, his knife clattering to the ground. Butch lunged, but I sidestepped, driving an elbow into his ribs. He stumbled back, gasping. The room remained silent. No one moved. They were waiting for my signal. I turned to the men standing nearby. My men. Without looking, I tossed my car keys to one of them. There's a bag in the trunk, I said. Bring it. The man nodded and disappeared outside. The rest of the men stayed in place, waiting. A minute later, he returned, carrying a large duffel bag. He placed it in front of me. I unzipped it slowly, pulled out 2 women's dresses. I held them up, let Gabe and Butch get a good look. Their confusion returned. I turned to my men. Dress them. No hesitation. 20 men descended on them. Fists, boots, pain. Their screams filled the air, but no one stopped. By the time they were finished, Gabe and Butch were barely conscious. They were forced into the dresses, torn, bloodied, humiliated. I turned to one of my men. Do they look good? The response was loud, unanimous, perfect. Laughter erupted, then silence. I raised a hand. Take them to the tannery. 2 men grabbed them, dragging their limp bodies toward the door. They didn't fight. They didn't have the strength left to. I pulled out my phone, dialed Sophia. She answered on the second ring, her voice soft. How is Naomi? I clenched my jaw. She's in a coma. A pause. Maybe guilt. Maybe pretending. Either way, I didn't care. But I knew. She had no idea she'd been caught. I let out a sigh. Listen, I need a break from all this. A friend is hosting a lavish party, and I want you to come with me. Sophia perked up instantly. A party? Yeah, I said. Exclusive. And just what we need to take our minds off things. She chuckled. I could hear the excitement in her voice. That actually sounds amazing. I smiled. A smile without warmth. Great. I'll pick you up at 8. She was more than happy to come. 2 hours later, we were at the nearest airport. She marveled at the private jet waiting for us. Ran her fingers along the smooth leather seats. This is so luxurious, she murmured. I nodded. Took my seat. The flight was silent. I stared out the window, lost in thought. Sophia scrolled through her phone, humming to herself. When we landed in Tijuana, a black luxury car was already waiting. The driver, large, silent, opened the door. Sophia slid in first. I followed. As we drove through the dimly lit streets, she leaned closer to me. This place is different. Are you sure this is safe? I chuckled. Don't worry. My friend owns this whole area. No one will touch us. She relaxed, smiled. After a short drive, we arrived at a massive mansion on the outskirts of town. The gates swung open. Music, laughter, golden lights bathed the grand estate. This is it, I said, stepping out. Sophia's eyes widened. Wow, this is incredible. I placed my hand on the small of her back, guided her forward. Inside, a well-dressed woman led us through the lavish halls to a luxurious room. Sophia admired the decor, ran her fingers along the polished furniture. Then the door swung open. A man entered, confident stride, short, broad-shouldered, neatly trimmed beard, sharp gaze. His suit was immaculate, but his presence carried an unmistakable air of power. He spread his arms wide, grinning. "Senor Daniel," he said. "Long time." I smirked as he pulled me into a firm hug, patted my back. Then he turned to Sophia, took her hand, gently. "And you must be his wife. A pleasure to meet you." He kissed the back of her hand smoothly. "My name is Santiago Lopez. Your husband was my teacher." Sophia tilted her head. "Teacher?" Lopez's grin widened. "He taught me how to cook." Sophia blinked. "Cook? But he never cooked for me." Lopez chuckled. "Oh, he didn't? Don't worry, Querida. Tonight I will request him to cook." Then he turned back to me. And this time his grin turned wicked. And this time he said I have a special recipe for him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the estate came alive with warm lights and the hum of anticipation. Sophia stood in front of a grand mirror, adjusting her dress, a deep red gown that hugged her curves perfectly. She was focused, applying the final touches of her makeup when a knock echoed through the door. I walked over and opened it. A well-dressed man with a knowing smile handed me a sleek black box. "The package you ordered, Senor Daniel." I nodded in thanks, closing the door behind me. Turning to Sophia, I held the box in front of me. "I got you something special." Her eyes sparkled with excitement. "A gift?" I nodded, opening the box to reveal a pair of stunning ankle-strap pumps. She gasped. "Oh my God, they match my dress perfectly." She slipped them on, taking a few steps, admiring how they felt. Then she walked up to me, wrapped her arms around my neck, and pressed a soft kiss to my lips. "I love them," she whispered. I smiled, taking her hand in mine. "Shall we?" With her arm hooked in mine, we stepped out of the room, walked hand in hand toward the dining area. Sophia's brows furrowed as she looked around. The soft glow of lanterns illuminated a large dining table. A pristine white cloth, golden cutlery, everything exuded luxury. But the silence, the stillness, it was unnatural. She turned to me, confusion clear in her voice. "You said party. But where are the guests?" Lopez, standing tall in his tuxedo, let out a low chuckle. "Ah, Senora Sophia, we don't need guests. But trust me, this party is going to be unforgettable." Something in his tone made her uneasy. I could see it. The way her fingers twitched slightly. The way her breath hitched for just a moment before she forced a smile. She stepped forward, her gaze falling on the grand table. Two massive plates sat at the center, their lids polished to a gleaming shine. Lopez gestured toward a chair. "Please sit." Sophia hesitated, but after glancing at me for reassurance, she finally lowered herself into the cushioned seat. I walked around the table, took my place across from her, keeping my eyes locked on her face. With a subtle nod from Lopez, two of his men stepped forward. They lifted the heavy plates, placed them directly in front of her. Sophia glanced at me again. I could tell her nerves were growing. She let out a small, nervous laugh. "This is quite the setup," she murmured, glancing at the covered dishes. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm. "It's a special night, Sophia." Lopez gave another nod. One of the men stepped closer. He reached out, gripped the handle of the lid. With one swift motion, he lifted it. Sophia's scream cut through the still night air. Raw, filled with terror. She stumbled back. Her chair tipped. But before she could hit the ground, two of Lopez's men caught her, forced her back into place. Her hands trembled. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Her wide eyes locked onto the severed heads in front of her. Gabe, Butch, their lifeless faces frozen in permanent horror. Bloodied, mouths agape. She turned to me, her face drained of all color. "Daniel, what is this?" Her voice was barely a whisper. I leaned forward, rested my elbows on the table, my fingers interlaced. My voice was steady, controlled. "If you wanted money, I would have given you money. If you wanted freedom, I would have given you freedom." I tilted my head slightly, watching as fresh tears welled in her eyes. "But you wanted my life." She shook her head frantically. No, no, it's not like that, I cut her off. My voice grew colder. My life belongs to my daughter, Sophia. She is the most precious thing to me. And right now, she is in a coma, fighting for her life. Because of you. She let out a choked sob. Her hands trembled in her lap. Daniel, please, I didn't mean. I exhaled slowly, shook my head. I cannot overlook it. And I cannot forgive it. I gestured toward the table. There are consequences, Sophia. Just like there were for Gabe and Butch. Her gaze flickered back to the severed heads. She gagged, covered her mouth. I smirked slightly, then gestured toward her feet. By the way, I hope the pumps you're wearing are comfortable. I let my words sink in, before adding, these two gave their lives for them. Lopez chimed in. Senor Daniel, I have a special marination just for this occasion. I leaned back, smiled. Please, let me learn from my student this time. Lopez grinned, signaled his men. 2 men entered, carrying a large vat filled with clear liquid. They walked toward Sophia. Then they poured it over her. Sophia gasped. The thick liquid soaked through her dress, clung to her skin. Her breath came in shallow, panicked bursts. Her wide eyes darted between me and Lopez. She tried to move, but the men held her firmly in place. Lopez chuckled, admired his work. Odorless, he mused, swirled a bit of the liquid between his fingers. Looks just like water, just a bit thick in consistency. Sophia whimpered. Her voice broke. Daniel, please. What is this? I leaned back in my chair, watching her carefully. You'll find out soon enough. My voice was calm, deliberate. Lopez dusted off his jacket, then gestured toward me. Senor Daniel, I suggest you step back. Wouldn't want any accidents? I held Sophia's gaze for a long moment, then slowly rose from my seat. Without a word, I took a few measured steps away. Sophia's breath hitched. She sat frozen. Her eyes darted between me and Lopez. Lopez smirked, reached into his pocket, pulled out a match, struck it. A tiny flame burst to life. Sophia's eyes widened in sheer horror. No, no, please, Daniel, Lopez still smiled. Let the match fall from his fingers. The tiny flame tumbled through the air, spinning lazily, before gravity pulled it down, straight toward Sophia. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning. I stood there, watching, letting the silence settle. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. My mother's name. A single message. Naomi is awake. I sighed deeply. Another message came through. Sending you a picture. I clicked the image. The raging fire still consuming the remains of Sophia. I sent it to her. A moment later, a thumbs up emoji appeared. I could almost hear her quiet approval in my mind. I pocketed my phone, turned to Lopez. His face was unreadable. He spoke quietly. Senor Daniel, is Naomi all right? I took a deep breath, looked him in the eye. She's awake. Lopez sighed, then nodded. I lost my little angel years ago, he murmured. It hurts to see angels get hurt. I met his gaze. As long as there are demons, I said, angels will get hurt. It's up to us. How many demons we can slay. Lopez gave a small nod, understanding, and I knew this wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. I reached for it, blinking against the sunlight streaming through the hotel window. It was my mother. Again, I answered. Daniel. Her voice was calm, controlled, but I could hear something beneath it, urgency. Naomi is stable, but we need to talk. I sat up. What's wrong? A pause. Then, come home. The flight back to Tennessee was quiet. Lopez had arranged everything. A private jet, a car waiting at the airport. He didn't ask questions. He knew I had unfinished business. By the time I landed in Knoxville, the sun was already setting. I drove straight to the hospital. I walked through the hallways, past the cold, sterile white walls, past the tired nurses and worried families. Then I saw her, Naomi. She was awake. Her eyes were heavy, her skin pale, but she was breathing on her own. Alive. I stepped into the room. She turned her head slowly, her gaze meeting mine. Dad? Her voice was weak, but it was there. I exhaled, stepping closer. I reached for her hand, gripping it gently. I'm here, baby. She swallowed, Her eyes flickered with something. Something deep. Fear. Pain. Memories. Then she whispered, I remember. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. What do you remember? I asked softly. Her fingers tightened around mine. Tears welled in her eyes. I remember their faces, she whispered. I kept my face neutral, calm. But inside, the fire reignited. Tell me, I said. She took a slow, shaky breath. There were two of them, she said. They were talking, arguing. One of them kept saying something about Mom. Sophia. I clenched my jaw. Naomi's lips trembled. They knew my name, Dad. My grip on her hand tightened. They said they were supposed to be there for you. My body went still. Rage boiled under my skin. She looked at me, her voice cracking. They hurt me because of you. I sat in silence for a long time. Naomi fell asleep, her hands still gripping mine. I watched her, breathed her in, and I made a promise. Whoever else was involved or whoever gave the order, they would pay. All of them. I met my mother outside the hospital. She was leaning against a black sedan, arms crossed. She didn't greet me. Didn't ask about Naomi. She just said, there's one loose end left. I knew what she meant. Who? I asked. She pulled out a small burner phone and tossed it to me. I caught it. Pressed play. A recording. Sophia's voice. Another man's voice. An argument. Then a name. Ralph Kingston. I exhaled. The kid. The one Lopez had warned me about. He was young, ambitious, and reckless. And he wanted me dead. I stared at the phone, then looked at my mother. She raised an eyebrow. What's the move? She asked. I smirked. Then I turned. Opened the car door. Slid inside. Fastened my seatbelt. She got in on the other side. Started the engine. I exhaled slowly. Then I said the only words that mattered. Let's finish this. The drive back to my house was quiet. The weight of everything sat heavy in my chest. But my mind was clear. Focused. Ralph Kingston. The name echoed in my head like a slow drumbeat. The last loose end. The man who thought he could take my life. He had no idea what he had just walked into. My mother pulled into the driveway. The house was dark. Still, she turned off the engine but didn't move. Instead, she looked straight ahead and said, You know how this ends, don't you? I nodded. Yes. A pause. Then she exhaled and turned to me. Do what you have to do. Inside, my office was untouched. The same leather-bound books. The same desk. The same hidden room in the back. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. Flicked on the light. The old chest sat in the corner. I knelt down, lifted the lid. Inside, everything was as I had left it. A black tactical suit. Gloves. Knives. And at the bottom, a Jericho 941. I picked it up. Ran my fingers along the cool steel. Checked the magazine. Fully loaded. Ready. I stood. Rolled my shoulders. Then I slipped into the suit. Pulled on the gloves. Checked my watch. 11:45 p.m. time to work. I met Jordan Novak outside a small warehouse just outside the city. He was waiting by his car, smoking a cigarette. When he saw me, he smirked. Didn't take you long, he said. I shrugged. I don't waste time. He nodded. Then handed me a phone. Kingston's inside. 3rd floor. He's expecting company but not you. I checked the phone. A live security feed. Cameras on every entrance. Every hallway. Every room. I watched as Kingston paced inside an office, talking to his men. 3 bodyguards. Armed. But sloppy. I handed the phone back to Jordan. He crushed his cigarette under his boot. Then asked, You want backup? I smirked. Don't need it. I moved fast. Silent. The first guard never saw me coming. A quick knife to the throat. No sound. No struggle. The second guard turned the corner just as I was hiding the first body. I grabbed him, snapped his neck, dragged him into the shadows. The third guard was smarter. He was already reaching for his gun when I slipped behind him and buried my blade into his ribs. He gasped, slumped forward, dead. I stepped over the bodies, made my way to the office door, took a slow breath. Then I kicked it open. Ralph Kingston jumped at the noise. His eyes went wide. His hand darted toward the gun on his desk. But I was faster. Aimed. Fired. The bullet hit the gun, sending it skidding across the floor. Kingston froze. His hands lifted slowly. Wait! I shot him in the knee. He screamed, fell to the ground, clutching his leg. I stepped closer, kicked his chair out of the way, then crouched in front of him. His face was twisted in pain. Sweat dripped down his forehead. He looked up at me, fear in his eyes. "Please," he gasped. I tilted my head. "You sent men after me," I said. "Tried to kill me, hurt my daughter." He shook his head. "It wasn't personal. It was just business." I smirked. "That's the problem, Kingston." I pressed the gun to his forehead. "For me, it is personal." Bang. The warehouse was silent when I walked out. Jordan was leaning against his car, waiting. When he saw me, he raised an eyebrow. "That quick?" I nodded. "It's done." He took a slow drag from his cigarette, then flicked it away. "So what now?" I looked up at the sky. The stars were clear. The air was crisp. I thought about Naomi, about my mother, about everything that had happened. Then I looked back at Jordan. I exhaled. "Now," I said, "I go home." I stepped into Naomi's hospital room just as the first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the windows. She was asleep, peaceful, alive. I sat beside her, watched her breathe. Then, for the first time in a long time, I let myself close my eyes. And I finally rested, and that's the end of this brutal story. Was Daniel's revenge justified, or did he go too far? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this, like, share, and subscribe for more. See you in the next one.